Reform Initiative and the McCloskey Speaker Series. Thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. As our guests are introduced today, you'll find links to their bios in the chat, as well as other important information throughout the event. If you'd like to submit a question for our panel, please type them into the Q&A feature during the event. You'll find that feature at the bottom of your toolbar. Thanks again for joining us. At this time, we'd like to welcome Aspen Institute President and CEO, Dan Porterfield.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that introduction and for all who are being here. And I'd particularly like to thank our trustee, Bonnie McCloskey, and her family for support of the McCloskey Lecture Series. This is such a critical conversation that we're having today on criminal justice transformation in the age of COVID-19 and beyond. And our broader purpose as a nonprofit organization is to drive change towards a free, just, and equitable society. And in perhaps no other area of our mission is this work we're talking about more relevant than this big, broad, complex, deeply critical moral issue of criminal justice and legal systems in the country, how they are structured and who they impact. I would really like to thank Doug Wood, who joined the Institute last year from the Ford Foundation, who you're going to hear from in a moment, for his leadership at the Institute on our new initiative on criminal justice reform. This is a critically important priority for us. And Doug is setting a standard for what change can look like, how to drive change in the American criminal justice system. His work is about developing in part a justice audit with the Justice Mapping Project that can be used in partnership with communities so they will have the tools, better tools in the future to hold their justice systems accountable for fairness, equity, and anti-racism. His work's contributing to the national dialogue that others in the Institute as well are taking part in on how is it that we focus on reform and transformation in criminal justice. How do we lift up voices that are not always heard and make sure that there's action coming out of a more robust conversation of the legacies of inequality, racism, and equity that have defined criminal justice. There's more to it than I can possibly summarize, of course. So these are things that we know about as a society. It's sometimes said that the COVID crisis has laid bare some things that we didn't know about, but I think we do know about so many of the inequities. And what's different about this moment, perhaps, is that we can step up to drive change. It's a window, an opportunity for the driving of change. That makes this distinctive, and that change is needed so very much. Each of you who have joined this dialogue today have been thinking about these issues. You're here because you know that we have deep work to do as a society. And we have some of the right voices in this conversation today to help us all think about what we can do to be forces for good and for change. So Doug will introduce for you Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, the national leader on all issues of justice, and has really focused the Ford Foundation on justice as the animating value and theme for all of their work. Anna Deavere Smith, who is an extraordinary actress, playwright, teacher, thinker, author, and trustee of the Aspen Institute, and her most recent play and film, Notes from the Field, picks up so many of these themes and with characteristic brilliance and insight for all of us. Vivian Nixon, who is the executive director of the College and Community Fellowship, a force of nature and a force for good in our society, associated with Aspen Institute's Ascend program as well, who has been really looking at all the different issues around higher education for women who have had their lives impacted by policing, prosecutions, correction systems, the whole continuum from where policing happens to what are defined as crimes, to how law enforcement interacts, to what crimes go to trial, to prosecutorial discretion, to how people are sentenced, to where they're sentenced and what happens when they're in prison. All of that contains within it urgent need for change and structural racism, and as well as also, I believe, structural sexism that has to be part of today's conversation about what kind of a society can we build. Who better than this group here today, joined later by Andrew Plepler, a global head of ESG of Bank for America, to be in that conversation with all of us. Thank you. Let me now please invite Doug Wood to get us started.
Thank you so much, Dan, for those words and your support of Aspen's criminal justice work. I'd like to welcome all the viewers to this webinar and invite you to later submit your questions to our outstanding panel. I'd also like to thank Bonnie and Tom McCloskey for supporting the McCloskey Lecture Series. Aspen's new criminal justice work is anchored in the idea of community-involved justice. For as Renita Francois has said, the time for communities to self-determine their own safety is now. This moment presents a powerful grassroots call for transforming the criminal justice system as we know it. It is reshaping public debates and policies. The boldness of today's social movement is not something Aspen can afford to ignore. In light of this, we ask ourselves, what is Aspen's role in amplifying bolder conversations around reimagining existing systems of policing and incarceration, while at the same time recognizing overlapping inequalities in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty? I'm pleased that today we have three amazing leaders who are already engaged in what I would call the audacity of boldness. Please help me welcome Anna Deavere Smith, professor, playwright, and actor, and founding director of the Institute on the Arts and Civic Dialogue at NYU, Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, and Reverend Vivian Nixon, executive director of College and Community Fellowship and an Aspen Ascend Fellow. Welcome to you all. Now on to Vivian.
Thank you so much, Doug. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you and an honor always to be involved with anything produced by the Aspen Institute. There is so much to talk about. I just want to provide about 90 seconds of context before we get into a conversation with two of my favorite people, and Darren Walker. It's hard to overstate how much the ground has shifted over the past few months, fueling new prospects for transformation of the criminal justice system in the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare ongoing and overlapping inequalities that exist in neighborhoods with high rates of incarceration and poverty. Social unrest and mass protests, the largest demonstrations in American history, continue to erupt across the country, prompted by viral videos capturing the senseless killings of Black people at the hands of seemingly unaccountable police officers. This has fueled increasing public support for a contemporary movement to reimagine the criminal justice system in a way that also takes into consideration underlying social, economic, education, and health disparities and achieves safety and justice through community-driven approaches. To that end, Renita Francois writes, "We can no longer strip entire neighborhoods of resources and tell its residents to build a future with broken tools. It is past time to divest from punitive enforcement and invest in well-being and opportunity. The days of using conditions that the government helped create as an excuse to over-police neighborhoods are over. It's time for communities to self-determine their own safety." And with that, I am hoping that we can have a conversation about how COVID has changed the game. These protests, the heightened sense of racial inequities in policing and in other areas of our system, it goes beyond reducing issues of mass incarceration to issues of policing and criminal justice, and moves it into reimagining our society and what the social contract really means. I'd like each of you to comment on that. Is this bigger than just policing and criminal justice?
I'm going to let Darren tee it off.
Thank you. Thank you, Reverend Nixon. It's a great honor to be in a virtual room with the inimitable Anna Deavere Smith. to be hosted by an organization that truly does transformational work in the Aspen Institute. And of course, the generosity of the McCloskey family also deserves recognition. I, Reverend Nixon, believe that we are in a moment of transformation as a society, a moment where we are reckoning with historic truths that not all of us were willing to face up. But in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, we no longer can deny. Racism remained deniable for many, many white Americans until that horrific killing. And I think many white Americans experienced heartbreak, deep, profound grief at the murder of George Floyd, because it truly made racism no longer deniable, institutional, structural racism no longer deniable. But we must remember that African Americans have had our hearts broken too for 400 years, dealing with the truth that we know, which is that racism is real. And so I think that at the root of this is that reality, and we are all trying to reckon with it. But what we know now is that token incremental responses are insufficient, and that we do need to think about transformation. But to the point, I do believe that it is important for us to say clearly that justice and safety are our objective. And some have framed this conversation in a false dichotomy. We either have safety or we have justice, but we can't have both. I categorically reject that idea, because we can have both. We can have safe communities, and we can have Black and brown bodies treated with dignity and not indiscriminately mowed down by law enforcement. So that's, I think, what we are trying to reckon with and work our way through as a society. That is the work of this moment.
Absolutely. I love the way you phrase that it's not a dichotomy. We can have both safety and justice. And I think that is dependent upon us agreeing what safety looks like, right? What is public safety? What is justice? In order to get there, I think, Anna Deavere Smith, you are the master of narrative. And getting people to, through narrative, understand what it's like to live in someone else's skin. Literally, that's what you do. Narrative change and uplifting the voices of those communities who have been most affected by the way we have approached justice in the United States is really important at this time. How will shifting and shaping a narrative that is rooted in and recognizes our deep-seated history of racial inequity lead to honest conversations about truth and reconciliation and healing?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Dr. Reverend Doctor. And I so admire you, and Darren, you know how much I admire you, and people have heard me say that and write that in public many times. And I just want to take a minute to thank Doug, and also to thank Mr. Porterfield for putting, really the weight of the Aspen Institute behind criminal justice. I just want to say how proud I am to be a board member in this particular moment. Vivian, I don't know that the work of constructing a narrative that grabs people at the level of, the people who sell cars I don't know that that's what I do. I consider myself a clown that is not self-deprecating. I'm really talking in the tradition of French and Italian clowns, Shakespeare's fools, witch doctors and griots in Africa. And so people like me are never actually speaking a direct idea. The idea is implied. It is covert, to quote my dear friend, the late James Cone, Reverend James Cone, right? As we know, he coined that word, Black liberation theology, in his book, Black Theology, Black Power. It is never overt what I do. It is covert what I do. And the covert thing that I'm doing is trying to learn the language of the moment, first by learning the official language of the moment, and then by interviewing many, many more people who are actually in the street, in the jails, in the hospitals, the people struggling to lead with no resources, that I start to learn the unofficial language. So when, getting the sort of brief of what today was going to be with the two of you, I went back and I talked to three of my favorite people. One who speaks the unofficial language, one who speaks stands on both sides of official and unofficial, and one who speaks the official language. And the person who speaks the unofficial language is Twilight Bay. I made a play about the riots in Los Angeles, which we know brought up a lot of the social justice story and a lot of the police reform story when Rodney King was killed by 4 police officers. And it's the first time that the world saw that brutality. And Twilight was a gang member who I met. I was very surprised. He was even willing to meet with me. And I gave him high honors in my play after having talked to 320 people and writing several drafts, is that the play is named after him and he has the last word. The last word is of our very, very powerful position. And I had a chance to speak with him again. He's now living in England, and really, a person with, I think, modest education, actually, looking at this problem internationally at this point, 30 years later. And when I asked him about this moment, post George Floyd, if it was unprecedented, he didn't really say it was. And when we think about things like colonialism falling, I mean, there have been big things that have happened that have pushed the purpose and the possibility for Black and Brown and Asian people forward, right? But he had a transformative moment in his life when he was sitting in a parking lot, the height of his life as a gang member, waiting for his mother to come out of a grocery store, and had his little 2-year-old baby girl in his arms. And some people from another gang came up and put these huge guns. So this is back, in the 80s and 90s when this war was full force. And it was a transformative moment for him. And he was one of the architects of the big gang truce between the Crips and the Bloods. And I said to Twilight, I said, well, you had a transformative moment. What does it take? And he said, you have to have fire. And he said, I don't know if in this moment there's the fire. And when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we have to remember that the United States is not like South Africa, where there was a willingness on both sides for fear that the whole country would collapse. It's not like Rwanda, where I visited right after the Gacaca trials, where the country had to get behind this idea of no possibility, no way forward without reckoning. So I have a moment of caution. I have caution about this moment. I think it's a very malleable moment. I think there are many possibilities, but my lifetime has shown me that the window is short. I hope it's bigger than it's been before, but I just wanted to start there with some unofficial language about this moment to say that we should know more about history as we talk about it, to learn what worked and didn't work. We should be careful to distinguish the United States from other nations. And for those of us who want to move, we may not have very much time to move.
Well, that is all very excellent advice, and hard to follow, because there are so many people now who are, for the moment, fired up. And I think what you're expressing is that the concern that it's for the moment. and that behind that being fired up is not a whole lot of serious investigation into history and understanding the uniqueness of the American experience.
I won't go that far. I won't go that far. I take everything seriously, so I would never use anything that implied not serious. I'm in California right now, where there are fires everywhere, right? Real fires everywhere. And so fire, you know, there could be, I believe there is widespread fire in the will of the country. But we can see, I watch both the Democratic and the Republican debates. I watch the the Republican convention as if I were a Talmudic scholar. And I'm sure we all came away with concerns.
Well, I would just say on this point, we need radical thinkers. And I think this moment calls for radical thinkers. And I remember 10 years ago when Dr. Douglas Wood, my colleague at the Ford Foundation, brought me up to Eastern Correctional Facility, and he had an idea to convince the foundation that we could work and organize philanthropists to fund the education of prisoners, of incarcerated men and women. It is hard to believe, because of the amazing success that Doug had in advancing that idea, that was a radical idea, that many people sought to dissuade Doug from advancing because he would be disappointed ultimately, because the fits and starts around these kinds of innovations had left many people depleted and depressed, and we never could seemingly get it done. I use that example because to me, it does speak to, on the one hand, we know we need to do this. On the other hand, we've had fits and starts at this and never been able to get it done. I do believe that Anna is right, that we Black folks in this country especially have experienced both the elation at the possibility of change and the depression that comes from seeing just how little was willing to be given up. And I think that's the dialectic that we are conditioned, and that you, Reverend Nixon, are speaking to, and that Twilight was saying, is there really a commitment? And I think I want to be clear, just because white Americans' hearts were broken does not mean that they are ready to fully engage in what is at the core an issue of power and white supremacy, which, to my mind, we must excavate if we are truly willing and desirous of change.
I just want to jump in on that for a second, Reverend, because I'm thinking about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and I've been revisiting the letter from a Birmingham jail. And we know that part where the white preachers accuse him of being an extremist. And he says, well, you've spoken about our activities in Birmingham as extreme. And at first I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those as an extremist, but I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction out of being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love thy neighbors, bless them that curse you, pray for them that abuse you. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus? I bear on my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail for the rest of my life rather than make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This country cannot survive half slave and half free. And then he says, so The question is not whether or not we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists will we be? Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the preservation of justice? And I think that is this moment right now. And if you're not on the side of the cause of justice, and if you're not on the side of love, then I don't see how it can really take off. And so I believe in the narratives. Vivian, you go back to narrative. I do believe in the narratives of faith and love, and faith could be faith and money. I'm not just right. And so I believe in those narratives.
But Anna, I think you would also, as a Southerner, recognize that one of the disappointments for Dr. King was he was speaking to many Southern Baptists, Southern Christian clergymen for whom Christianity was a platform for white supremacy.
Absolutely.
Their faith was used, as is well documented in Robert Jones's book.
It still is.
That actually, as he says, and as I believe others have said, if you want to recruit members for the KKK, go to a white Southern church, because the views that are often held, and this is not to indict all Christians, all people from the South, that would be me.
And me.
But it does speak to why Dr. King and other faith leaders were so frustrated in the South with other religious, moral leaders, because we know that a part of white supremacy has been the perversion of Christianity and religion in the service of furthering white supremacy.
Well, you know, you interviewed Michael Sandel a couple of weeks ago. I'm interviewing tonight, and I recall interviewing him a long time ago. He quotes Immanuel Kant: "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made." And so it's not this or that. Of course, it's complicated. And I would say to any young people watching now is to, and this is to get back to the question about narrative, it's really hard because none of the real narratives are straight on. Every single thing that Darren is saying is absolutely true. At the same time, Darren, I want to say to you and me sitting here, and I suspect Reverend Nixon, I'm not sure, you know, when you talked about to Michael Sandel, you said, whenever you go on panels like at Aspen, you're the only person there without a Harvard, Yale, or an Ivy degree. Me too. I'm the only person sitting there without that stuff. But it does mean to me, you through Head Start, me through President Johnson, you know, there was this brief moment, right? They were looking for, you know, the also ran colleges were looking for nice Negro girls like Anna. And so, you know, we both kind of crept through. And that's what I mean by the window is short. How do you creep through? Because you and me didn't have a pedigree.
Definitely not.
You know, pedigree is far from my experience. They weren't handing out pedigrees in the Albion Correctional Facility.
Exactly. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a Harvard education right there.
But and that's what I want to come to. So we're talking about narrative, we're talking about power, and we're talking about the theme of education jumped in. And I want to talk about education for a minute in the context of everything that we talked about. Because there was a time 20 years ago when I first started doing this work, when the idea of going into prisons and providing education was very much about appeasing a certain narrative. That, you know, if you provide people with education, they will have a better chance of being productive citizens when they are released, better chance of getting employment. That narrative is no longer part of my discourse, because what I understand when I look at history, and it's the relationship of education to Black people in particular, and laws that were passed to prevent us from being educated, and the connection to chattel slavery, I have to think that somehow education is also about power. And it's not just about education, but the type of education. You talked about Twilight having a different type of education that gives him a sense of power and ownership over his life that you may not get in a formal education, but political education matters as well. So how do we embrace the political education of those who have the least power so that they can gain power?
That's beautiful. I mean, well, that takes me to my person I said who has the official and the non-official talk, and that's Ruslan Ali, who was a part of right in our hearts. Shout out to Ruslan Ali, who was actually a part in the Obama administration of coming up with the data that showed that, you know, our Black, Brown, Native American babies are the ones who get pushed out of school because of heavy duty disciplinary actions. And then, you know, then they're on the road to incarceration. If you're not in school, you're in trouble. So, and she's now running a very innovative and big project called the XQ Institute, which is it is really education reform. And so she actually she's really excited about this moment because she feels that COVID has made it mandatory that everybody has a computer and a hotspot. And she really believes that by the end of the year that everybody's going to have it. And she thinks also that it's a moment where we have to completely rethink so many things about education. What's the time, who's teaching who, and the fact of not having to be in the presence, as far as she's concerned, makes it more possible that a kid is going to have a relationship with a teacher that might be a more productive relationship than the kind that they've had before. At the same time, I just want to give a shout out again to Michael Sandel, who's already been interviewed by the Aspen Institute, because in his book, The Tyranny of Merit, you know, what happened to the common cause, I think I'm saying the subtitle the wrong way. He's really questioning this notion that what you earn, you know, you earn what you learn. He's really questioning that whole thing as a dream that's not true, and looking at the flaws of the people who climb that ladder and get to the top and how they have a lot of hubris. I mean, you did an excellent interview of him, Darren.
Thanks. I do think that it's so easy to be dejected and depressed and despondent by what we are confronted with on a daily basis. And so I try to think about, how do we get ourselves out of this quagmire? You know, what are the solutions? And I do think we have to talk about leadership, and not just leadership hierarchical, because leaders are in the streets and leaders are in community. But I do think we must talk about the poverty of leadership that we are experiencing in this country in many, many phases, many spheres, and how we need moral leadership, that it is not a political statement. This is in all spheres of American life. We need leadership that seeks to heal and seeks to unite, and reminds us that while we may all have our own identities, me as a Black queer man, the most important identity, I believe, is that identity that we share as Americans, because that is the aspirational idea. America is not only a place, it is an idea. And to the extent that we all are prepared to do the work to realize the idea, recognizing that realization means different things to different people. And that's where the rub is. That's where the public square sits, and where so many of us have been driven from it by politics, by the kinds of leaders who seek to divide us and not unite us. I think that we've got to deal with that as a critical ingredient for getting us out of this quagmire.
I couldn't agree more. And I hope again in this moment, whether the window is 6 months or 6 years, I do believe that it's bringing forth and is going to bring forth new leadership and new ways of looking. And that takes me to my third figure, the official language, Victor Carrion, chief of child psychiatry at Stanford University, who says that this election is critical because number one, police reform is on the line. The Affordable Care Act is on the line. In terms of children, that's really going to affect children. And only 1/3 of children get the mental health, for example, that they need. Kids and in school, as they're being educated in whatever way right now, if their parents are snatched by the police because we have not yet done effective reforming, that affects their lives. And so, I do think that we have to, as much as we can, encourage people to vote.
I agree. And unfortunately, we're out of time for our wonderful conversation. And we're going to take some questions from the audience. But let us remember as we move forward that this is a critical time. We need to address more than just the legal system. Our whole social contract is at risk. And we are capable of doing this if we maintain a sense of urgency, that fire, and if we remember our history as we move into our future. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you all for such a great conversation. I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. And so the first question is, given the window of opportunity, be it 6 months or 6 years, what are your thoughts about the future? And this is to everyone.
I will go first and say there is I was thinking about this last night because I often think about what it must have felt like to be in this country, enslaved, knowing that you would live your life never to be free. What it must have felt like to be Fannie Lou Hamer, to be a poverty-stricken sharecropper in a community ravaged by racism, to have a forced sterilization, to not live with dignity, and yet be committed to fight for freedom in this country. And I just think about so many people like that who came before me and did not give up. They fought to their last breath. What the hell would I have to complain about the struggle? What struggle? What struggle? The work that these people did to make it possible for me compels me to believe, demands of me that I be hopeful, because hope has always been, even for those enslaved people who knew they would never be free, they remained hopeful. So hope for me is you gotta wake up with it. And all you gotta do is think about the people whose shoulders we stand on, the people who gave blood so that, as Anna said, folks like us could be provided with an opportunity in that window. So that's how I remain hopeful.
Anna or Vivian?
I'm gonna piggyback on that. I remain hopeful because I watched my grandparents and my parents, work through the civil rights era and everything they could. They gave their whole lives so that I could have a better life. And even though I made a mess of that for many years, I finally came back around to it. You know, that old saying that if you train up a child in the way to go, which so will not depart from it. I came back to it, and I find that I don't mind the struggle. Someone, a young person recently asked me, well, do you think we're going to get there? Do you think we're going to get to abolition in our lifetime? And I had to be honest, and I said, I'm not sure in our lifetime, but that doesn't make me hopeless. I have what W.E.B. Du Bois called a hope, not hopeful, but not hopeless. I have a hope that is rooted in the struggle, because every day that I'm struggling, I know that there are other people walking alongside me also struggling. And so that it can't always be as it is if we continue the struggle. So I actually find hope in the struggle.
I'm a hopeaholic.
You're a hopeless hopeaholic.
You know, at MD Anderson Hospital, I did a project on healthcare and spent some time down there talking to people. Everybody walks around with a lanyard that says, make cancer history. And think about what that means. It's like, make it history, but also be history, be the one that be the group that finds the cure. And I kind of think for you know, I consider myself a race woman. That's an old fashioned thing, but whatever that is today for the younger kid, anybody who wants to be in this brigade, you know, I think we need a lanyard that says make racism history.
Well, thank you so much for your responses. And I'm going to get a chance to thank you again at the end. But right now I want to say thank you for your heart, your commitment, your great work, and your thoughts that you've shared with all of us. Thank you, Vivian, for moderating. Thank you, Darren and Anna. You've been just terrific. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our Q&A session. And so I'd like to pivot, if I could, to Andrew Plepler. We are pleased to have Andrew here to offer his thoughts. Andrew spearheads the company's focus on environmental society and governance issues at Bank of America. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Doug. I find myself sitting here still mesmerized by the panel and feeling somewhat inadequate to offer anything terribly meaningful to what's been said. But having been asked to provide closing comments, I can't pass up the opportunity to say a few words. And I find myself reflecting a lot on this hopeful and hopeless dynamic. And there are things I feel very hopeful for, and much of which has been stated. I work for a company headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, that has made $1 billion commitment over the next 4 years around racial equality and economic opportunity. A very diverse company with a very diverse customer base, a very diverse employee base, coalescing around this commitment to respond to the needs of society that we face today. And that's where change will happen, in my view, where coalitions of people, not always allies in some of these challenges, come together with that fire that we heard about to say, now is the time to not just make a headline, but now's the time to really deploy the resources and assets of a $2 trillion company with 200,000 employees to really challenge ourselves to do something different and to do it over time, not for a moment, not for an announcement, but really do the hard work. And the coalitions of corporations and nonprofits and advocates and regulators and policymakers all have a role to play. The tent is going to have to get bigger to be successful and to endure over time. The hopeless part is that I often find myself reflecting on some of my visits to the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum and the African American History and Culture Museum in DC, where I look at those pictures of almost exclusively white people standing on the streets during civil rights protests, during lynchings, who were observers. And I always find myself asking, what were they thinking? And how could people, to your earlier points about religious people, good Christians, allow themselves to be complicit in moments of such horror? And I challenge all of us, I think, to think about that, because we still are a fractured country, and we still are a country where a lot of people are spectators right now, and who stand on the sideline and observe and then get distracted, to Darren's point about the dynamic of a justice or safety. And we get distracted and we immediately pivot and start having a safety conversation. And you see how easy it is to shift. And that's what makes me nervous. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that doesn't happen, and that the focus remains on the issues that are so critical. And we are committed to continuing to work with you all at Aspen, and thank you so much for doing this. And Darren and Anna and Dr. Nixon, it's a privilege to share the stage, so to speak. So thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Andrew, and it's great to see you again. The last time I saw you was on stage at the Apollo, announcing the great PBS film College Behind Bars. So thanks for your support.
It was great to hear Darren reference that. So
yes,
great series for anyone who didn't watch it yet.
And I want to say thank you again to Darren Walker, Anna Deavere Smith, and Vivian Nixon, to all attendees for a wonderful and illuminating discussion. Stay tuned next week for the next episode of our new podcast, Shades of Freedom, with guest Dwayne Betts discussing the Million Books Project. Have a great rest of your day.
On behalf of the Aspen Institute's Criminal Justice Reform Initiative and Aspen Community Programs, thanks for joining us for Criminal Justice Transformation in the age of COVID and beyond. If you are interested in criminal justice issues, please subscribe to Aspen's newest podcast series, Shades of Freedom, available on your favorite podcast app. You can find out more about the Criminal Justice Reform Initiative, read our recent reports, view event videos, and join our email list at aspeninstitute.org/CJRI, or follow us on Twitter at AspenCJRI. CJRI's programs are made possible with support from the Ascendium Education Group, Arnold Ventures, the Bank of America Charitable Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and Google.